Trump promises to to weaponize law against his opponents. He wants to stay in power indefinitely, and they're planning to fire the civil servants, tens of thousands of them, whose job it is to execute the laws as written. So without the rule of law, you're looking at a bumbling, stumbling, impoverished, unpredictable United States.
So, Tim, can we kick things off? Can I ask you to explain the fundamental premise of this book, which is basically that many of us have got freedom wrong and that we look at freedom as the absence of state power. Can you explain why that's wrong and how we should instead think about freedom?
Well, emotionally, what I notice is that when people talk about freedom, they're angry. And that's a sign that something is up. Because when we talk about freedom, we should be glad. When we think about freedom negatively, it's us against a barrier, us against oppression, us against everyone else. And of course, sometimes we are oppressed and we do have to react. Like I just came back from Ukraine a couple of weeks ago. There are moments where you do have to fight back. But the reason why you need freedom from the bad things is to get freedom to the good things. So freedom is ultimately not just about clearing things away, but building things up. And it's not ultimately about what other people are stopping you from doing, but what you want to do, what you really think is good, and how you're going to make that happen.
So you just mentioned that the idea of negativity. So you have these two concepts about negative liberty and positive liberty. Can you just unpack those slightly?
Yeah, I mean, they're not my concepts. It's a great mistake made by my teacher, Isaiah Berlin. There is really no such thing as negative freedom, I don't think. The notion of negative freedom is that negative freedom means freedom from the government oppressing me. But the only reason why the wall is bad is that a person's on the other side of it. The only reason why the barbed wire is bad is the person. The reason why a concentration camp is bad is because of the people. And when you remove the wall, the barbed wire, when you destroy the concentration camp, and I'm citing people who liberated concentration camps, those people are still not free. You have to heal the trauma. You have to educate the people. And those extreme cases reveal, I think, a basic everyday truth, which is that if we want free people, we have to start from our human predicament at birth and think about the conditions we'd have to have in place so that people can grow up to affirm values, realize them, change the world the way they want to. That's real freedom. That's positive freedom.
So talking of values, one of the other things you were saying in the book is that a lot of the things we associate with freedom, including free speech and religious liberty, have all been co-opted by the right. Can you explain a little bit more about how so?
It has to do with freedom being making you angry. That's the sign that something is wrong, and it comes down to making negative freedom common sense, which I think it is for most Americans and for many people in the UK as well. That freedom means following my impulse. So freedom means that if I'm upset, I should say whatever I want to say. And that's all well and good. But when you give up to impulse, you're really probably inside somebody else's story. And I think freedom probably has more to do with your ability to have your own views, which are not us and them, for or against, but something eccentric, unpredictable, weird, and personal. When it comes to free speech, what we've talked ourselves into is the idea that free speech is about an unseen oligarch with multiple social platforms having the ability to algorithmically transmit trillions of messages. But that's not what it's about. Freedom of speech is about the risk that a human being takes speaking truth to power. And so you have to start not from the utterance, which is usually algorithmic and irrelevant in any event now, and start from the person, especially the least fortunate person. If you're protecting them, then you're protecting freedom of speech. Or better put, I think, you're creating free speakers. Ultimately, freedom is about the person. It's about the speaker.
So the co-opting of things like free speech by, as you say, sort of algorithmic oligarchs, what has that meant for democracy? And how can others not on the right reclaim them?
Yeah, I mean, democracy is going to be a corporeal thing. It's going to be you knowing things about the world, talking to other people who know things about the world. You're going to have different values. They're going to have different values, but you're going to share basic facts. What social media has tended to do is draw us away from the world around us, but also to strip the world around us of facts by putting the fact finders out of business. Those of us who care about democracy are going to have to acknowledge some of the things that I call the forms of freedom in the book, like, for example, factuality. And we're going to have to think about supporting the institutions that generate the facts because they don't grow from the ground and the truth doesn't automatically rise to the top. You have to care about those things and support them.
So you mentioned that you were quite recently in Ukraine, and I know you've visited quite a lot for a long period of time since you were a student, I believe. And you've spoken to President Zelensky quite a lot. And in fact, he's one of the blurbs on your book. When you think about freedom there, I wondered how you think about the existential and the conceptual notions of freedom and how they interact with the more practical ideas of defending freedom and freedom surviving on a sort of military level, on an everyday level
Mhm.
for Ukrainian people.
Yeah, when I thought the book was finished, I took it to Ukraine. I took it to Ukraine 3 times, and I talked to people, and I rewrote the manuscript there. And it's the reason I did that was, of course, the obvious one that you say, that people are taking risks for freedom. But what's interesting is what the Ukrainians tend to mean by freedom, which is the positive thing we've been talking about. I have yet to meet a Ukrainian who says we'll be free when the Russians are gone. What they say is we were on our way to something better. We were building something better. We had a future ahead of us, and the Russians came in and broke it and got in the way. So getting the Russians out, which the Ukrainians interestingly just called deoccupation, not liberation, getting the Russians out is just a step towards what you might have, which is freedom in the future. But then there's also this question of character. Freedom is about values. It's not about impulses. And so the decision that Ukrainians took, for example, the decision of the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, to stay, that's an example, in my view, of freedom. Because, of course, if you just follow impulse, you're going to run. And honestly, that's what many people in the West thought they would do. But if you're a free person and you've made commitments based on values, sometimes precisely because you're free, you have to stay.
I thought that was really interesting that you talked to him about that choice. And he actually, I think, called it, or you described it as a choiceless choice. He said he
Mhm.
didn't have any other choice, and you said he was choiceless. Some observers have predicted that ultimately there won't be a choice other than to cede parts of Ukraine to Russia in order to end the conflict. How do you see that?
I think that's a mistake. I mean, we didn't cede. During. I think it's a mistake to give up on the international legal order, is what I would say. The entire post-war international legal order is based on the notion that there are states and borders, and we don't invade one another and take one another's territories. I wouldn't concede that. Of course, you can't predict which soldiers are going to be on which territory at which point, but I believe the war is going to end when one side has predominance over the other. That we have good reason to try to make sure that that country is Ukraine, and that regardless of what the settlement is, it should certainly involve EU membership for Ukraine, NATO membership for Ukraine, and at the very least, the political and legal and durable aspiration that all territories that are legally Ukraine's return to Ukraine. That's a principle which is held up elsewhere, and I don't think we should give up on it now.
Do you think there's a time limit on how long people can support that effort?
I mean, the Ukrainians are the ones doing all the fighting. It's a curious sort of European or really even world war where the stakes are global. The stakes have to do with China, they have to do with the international order, they have to do with nuclear proliferation. And the Ukrainians are doing it all. They're doing it all themselves. And all we have to do is provide material support. So we are not tired. We can talk ourselves into the idea that we're tired. Journalists can decide that they want to talk about something else, but we're not tired. We could support them indefinitely. They need our help to keep going. That's the critical question. They're the ones who are doing the suffering. I think what we have to do is make sure that we're doing the things we do well, like economic sanctions and the transfer of weapons, to make sure that not too many of them, and to put it very directly, have to die. There is a limit on the number of Ukrainians, but the war's not going to be over until pressure on Russia is sufficient to bring it to an end.
Yeah. Staying on Russia for a minute, you've previously
Mhm.
written a lot about the role of Russian disinformation in the 2016 election and
Mm.
in the Brexit vote as well. How much do you think we should worry about disinformation and interference in next month's election in the US?
It's going to turn out to be worse than we thought. I think we're kind of sleepwalking again, like we did in 2016. We're so distracted. Americans are so distracted by the candidates and the personalities, and we're very self-absorbed people. And it's hard for us to imagine that others from the outside are making a difference. I mean, I would suggest that something similar happened with Brexit. There was obviously very important and perhaps even decisive outside interference, but the British were very much focused on their own thoughts and feelings at the time, and it just seems preposterous, right? I think, though, that the root problem is one that the Russians diagnosed for us, which is that social media is set up for disinformation. It's not a bug, it's a feature. That's essentially what it's meant to do, is to drive us into emotional states which are anti-democratic and which get us to do things that are not in our own interests. That's the root problem that I hope after 2024 we'll have a chance to address.
All that said, how much should we be concerned about the very real possibility of a second Trump presidency?
I'm not. Yeah, that's. I think concern is a very polite word here. Trump represents. He doesn't represent a flaw in democracy or a detour away from democracy. He represents an entirely different way of doing politics, which is based on telling big lies about what happens in the world. Which is based upon uh, making people live in alternative realities, which is based upon a few favored people being wealthy and everyone else suffering, which is based, to be specific, on undoing the rule of law, which is a thing that the United States has going for it, the rule of law. But Trump promises to turn to weaponize law against his opponents. He wants to stay in power indefinitely, and they're planning to fire the civil servants, tens of thousands of them, whose job it is to execute the laws as written. So without the rule of law, you're looking at a bumbling, stumbling, impoverished, unpredictable United States, which of course is, which is why I say concern is a polite word.
Mm. And do you think if he loses, there are also going to be enormous consequences?
Well, I think everyone, I mean, you might as well start drafting your stories about like the disruptions in November. There will be disruptions in November when he loses. Um, that's just kind of baked in. That scenario is at this point just baked in. There's so many Americans who think that he shouldn't lose, or there's no such thing as Trump losing, or democracy doesn't really matter, the votes don't really matter, only the leader matters. So there's going to be some kind of disruption in November when he loses, or if he loses, there's going to be some kind of disruption. That's just kind of inevitable. I take that for granted. Unfortunately, after January 6th, that's just it's. I don't want to say part of the process, but it's something Americans are regard. Unfortunately, too many Americans regard as normal.
Mm. You mentioned the wealthy people and the kind of versus the rule of law in a way. I mean, last week we saw a millionaire presidential candidate at a rally supported by a billionaire who controls one of the most influential media platforms in the world, both of whom claim to be free speech warriors. Given what we were talking about at the beginning of this interview, explain what's so very wrong with that claim in your view.
Yeah, I mean, there's the obvious answer, which is that Trump, of course, keeps calling journalists enemies of the people, and the obvious answer about Musk, which is that he censors people on his own platform for saying things that he doesn't like every day, right? But the deeper answer is that speech has to do with the risks that we take when we say that people like Trump or Musk are doing something wrong. It doesn't really have to do with people like Trump and Musk. Their free speech is not threatened. The whole reason we have freedom of speech is to protect us, to protect normal people who have their own truths to tell in a world where there are too many Trumps and too many Musks. That's what it's for. If it gets flipped around to be a weapon of the Trumps and the Musks, then it's been completely perverted and we have to start thinking again, which is one of the subjects of the book.
Hmm. How do we do that? Do we just close down Twitter eventually?
We regulate it, man. We regulate it. I mean, the radio that we're doing right now is only possible because of government regulation. The book that I wrote is only possible because of government regulation. The ways that we communicate with one another take the forms they do because of conventions that we agree upon. There has never been a form of human communication which has functioned without some kind of convention, from the letters of the alphabet forwards, right? From the very language that we're using, there's always a convention. The idea that the internet should be an exception, that there should be no rules, and that the people who control it should make the rules up day to day is something entirely new in human civilization, which everybody from the Mesopotamians forward would have just laughed at. So that's the basic answer. If you're going to have human communication, there have to be conventions which allow everyone to communicate and give everyone a fair shot at having their voice heard. The idea that the people who got there first and are making the most money should warp it is crazy.
Right. And if you're going to have freedom, you need regulation to ensure that freedom. Yeah. Um,
It's true.
yeah. Tim, one reviewer said that your book asserts that all of America's ills can be ascribed to a fetishization of negative freedom that makes Americans meaner and sadder. And by equating an absence of constraints with freedom, Americans have actually made themselves less free. Is that accurate? And do you think this is a particularly concentrated problem in the US?
Yes, and yes. I do think we're meaner and sadder. And in the book, I try to not just make this argument analytically, but to talk about it in terms of experiences that I've had with American healthcare, for example, or talking to people inside American prisons. I think the notion that freedom is just about my impulse or banging my head against the wall, it leads very quickly to a notion that freedom is also us against them, that the other person is the barrier. And if freedom isn't about me and like actually asserting or having the confidence to say what I really care about and to take risks for that, I'm going to end up being herded and manipulated, not just sad, but also vulnerable, which I think a lot of the American population is right now. And yes, I do think a lot of it's conceptual. I think what we've done is we've taken this most noble of ideas, freedom, and we've made it into a kind of psychological tool which allows other people to hold us down. And that's what I want to work against.
Mm. Um, and one of the other things that you really mourn in the book is the decline, in fact, the near death, certainly in this country, of local journalism. Why do you think that's of such paramount importance for the sort of freedom that you describe and that we should be working towards?
First of all, because I think truth has a kind of human, a corporeal component, that our belief in truth has to do with human beings that we trust, like teachers, coaches, family members, friends, and that the local reporter, unlike the national reporter, is someone who you actually see, sitting in the stands at the football game. It's somebody who you know is real. You may not like their reporting, but you know they're actually a person. And the second thing is, when you take that negative point now, when you take that away, when people no longer have local journalism, as most counties in the US do not, most of the physical space in the US by far is now is not covered by a single reporter. When you take that away, then people leap up. They leap up to the national, which means to the polarizing, or to the international. They leap up to things where they don't necessarily know, nor do they necessarily even need to know, but there are readily available polarizing tropes there, which allow them to turn against each other and to tribalize. And so the more abstract it is, ironically, the more tribal everything becomes. And before you know it, folks who had been talking to each other about a local story in the newspaper are now fighting with each other about some kind of conspiracy theory. And that's what we have seen unfold in the US in the last 15 years with social media.
Mm. Before I let you go, Tim, I have to ask, someone's called you possibly the closest thing academia has to Dan Brown's adventurous professor, Robert Langdon. Are you a Dan Brown fan? And do you take it as a compliment, even though he was actually Harvard, not Yale?
That there are like three levels at which I feel like I don't know how to answer that question. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Dan Brown. I have no idea who you are. I'm sure you're famous. The First of all, I'm sure that that's not true. Like there are like anthropologists and there are academics who travel a lot more than I do, and there are you. Okay, so let me say something serious. I help run a program called Document in Ukraine, or Index, and we have funded about 500 Ukrainians, most of them scholars, who are doing their academic work in a country where the war is taking place. And like that's serious and that's
Yeah.
beautiful and that's valuable. The fact that I turn up from time to time is not comparable to the Ukrainians who are actually there documenting the war. And one could say the same for scholars in Gaza or scholars in Sudan or scholars in any war zone. So I mean it's sweet and everything, but like let's keep it real.